Welcome to The Beat. This is the podcast where we talk about building equity, accountability, and trust, specifically looking at American policing. Today, I am joined by two guests. My name is Dr. Lori Hall, and I have two amazing people here with me. If y'all want to introduce yourselves.
I'm Dr. Brandy Benson.
I'm Lucy Lewis. I'm a student.
Awesome. So today the topic that we're going to be covering is mental health crisis on the job. So we're specifically looking at the mental health challenges that law enforcement officers face in their day-to-day, what they're doing, right? And so there's a lot that they deal with, a lot of things that they witness, not just on a professional level, but also on a personal level.
Yes.
And so we, in order to really serve our officers, we really need to be mindful of these challenges that they're facing and be cognizant of what they're going through, right? To be mindful of this. And so I don't know, Dr. Benson, if you might want to speak a little bit. I know that you do a lot of work with law enforcement officers in the region and helping them to really kind of manage and mitigate the challenges that they're facing with what it means to be a police officer. So maybe if you want to kind of highlight a couple of the important things that they're kind of struggling with or challenged with in their day-to-day job.
Sure. And I think for context, as a clinician, so I've worked exclusively with first responders across the board. So whether it be law enforcement, fire, which is obviously adjacent, EMS, so on and so forth. I work as a clinician, but also in the capacity as an evaluator, which is really critical because when you ask a question like this, we take multiple approaches to those stressors that they are facing. So you were asking specifically, what are some of the stressors that they encounter in their personal lives or their professional lives? Professional. Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the most sensitive ones for me that I'm very mindful of is a large exposure to community rejection. I think when people actually pose this question, most lay individuals really want to target the traumatic exposures. So that could be child deaths, that could be exposures to suicides, it could be unattended elderly that end up dying, high crime areas, shootings, et cetera, et cetera. So I think traumatic exposures tends to be one of the more obvious answers that people come to when we talk about stressors. But realistically, I like to get into more of the nuanced ones, which are more of the conversations that we have therapeutically with our officers. So you've got someone that works on midnight shift, which means they can never connect with their spouse. And so their spouse feels in an isolated relationship, it creates resentment or feelings of disconnectedness for the officer. So just imagine that you are sleeping when everyone is doing things and you're up when everyone is sleeping. So you feel like life is living you and you're not living life, on top of then encountering a lot of these traumatic exposures. Think more too about community rejection. So we have seen a very repetitive cycle of we love the police, we hate the police. We love the police, let's support them. Oh, all of a sudden we hate them again and they all suck. So these cops, they're going through decades worth of a career and they're constantly feeling the love, feeling the rejection, feeling the love, feeling the rejection. Most of these people, from an identity perspective, entered into this career because they simply just wanted to belong, to help, to feel useful, purposeful, all natural things that we all want.
Right.
And then they're going into the community and they're being rejected for their actions or criticized for it, when really their intentions are quite pure and they're just humans. So imagine that going home and trying to be a dad, a mom, a supportive partner, a loving adult child to parents, so on and so forth. And of course, I mean, there are other stressors too, administratively. Sometimes, I think a lot of us have had bad bosses in our past. It's no different in a paramilitary structure. You're going to have some supervisors that are great and other supervisors that are highly critical, or don't really support succession planning or mastery of skills. So there's a lot of stressors facing these people. I feel like I could go on and on.
I think you bring up something that I don't necessarily think that I've actually engaged with.
Oh, good.
And it's this this rejection, right?
Mhm.
And you talk about it on both a personal and a professional level of just this constant, exposure to rejection. You're being rejected everywhere, and you just want to find a place. You went into it because you want to belong,
Yeah.
and here you are. The irony of this, right? And then also the scrutiny,
Mhm. Yeah.
the intense scrutiny that officers are constantly under a microscope, right?
Yes.
And I find it, really difficult to get people to understand, like you said, these are humans,
Yes.
right? These are individuals that have their own needs, their own desires, and they're human and they make mistakes.
Yes.
And we're constantly focused as a populace, right, on expecting officers to be subhuman, right? We
Agreed.
expect them to be these idyllic versions of what it means to be a human, to make no mistake, to make the right decisions all of the time. And if you don't, the persecution is annihilating.
Yes. But realistically, though, these people entered into this career knowing the level of responsibility that they were assuming. But I think what's a little different, so as a psychologist, in my graduate program, we are trained down to like, blood, sweat, tears of our ethical and legal obligations to the community. So we are not uh, uninformed about the layers of responsibility that I assume to become a practicing psychologist in my daily life, which means just to be funny, if I fart in the wrong direction and it's unethical, I have much greater consequences than someone who's not rendering medical care. So I think what's a little different is our law enforcement officers, this is a trade. These are tradespeople. Some of them have education beyond like college degrees and all of that. And a lot of them go on to get masters, some even doctorate once they're in the career. So these aren't uneducated individuals. They're very educated. But this is a trade. So we might harp on their legal responsibilities, but yes, their consequences for being human do carry greater consequences, greater responsibility, because whatever they do off duty does still have an impact on the community.
Right.
So, but I don't, that's a lot of pressure for a human
Oh,
to walk around
absolutely.
with.
The constant scrutiny, yeah, like that constant pressure, like people cannot exist in that way. And
Mm-mm.
people also, the populace is what I mean. Like the populace does not have that experience.
No. And just so interesting. I actually don't know if you guys know this, but it's on this point. So some of my prior work was actually in corrections. So I did federal prison with inmates. Very fascinating. Loved working with the criminal population. Really actually preferred more the other side of the house, right? Like the good side. But do you know that law enforcement actually has about the same rate of pre-existing trauma before they enter their career, and it matches that of a criminal population?
Wait, really?
Yeah. So over 50% of your inmates, whether it be federal, state, county, have pre-existing histories of trauma. That could be sexual abuse as a child. It could be high levels of neglect, toxic family environments, abandonment, rejection, drug exposure, anything. Do you know about 50% of your law enforcement actually have pre-existing histories of trauma? And that probably is one of the reasons that they sought out the career. It's a form of trauma treatment. So when you're under scrutiny from the public for being human, that's also someone probably poking at your trauma.
Oh my God. I never thought of it like that.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I guess that kind of makes sense. I've seen that whenever I talk to people. My uncle was in law enforcement, and he would tell me stories, and then you think about it, and then you learn more about him. Like I've asked people about his childhood. I ask him what happened with him, and I never thought of it like that, honestly. Just from the people I've interacted with, but I can see it. I mean, I've heard the stories.
Yeah. It's a form of resiliency building. It's a form of treatment. But if you think about it, let's go with one of the most common scenarios. It's a cop that grew up with a highly rejecting household. So, highly critical parents. Maybe it was a single family home and the one parent that was there was highly rejecting. Maybe they felt alone a lot of the time. They didn't feel good enough as a kid. So, think about what law enforcement offers them: a place to be purposeful, a place to feel important, a
Mhm.
place to have inherent purpose, a place to do good and belong. So not only like the fraternity of being at the department, but this idea of I belong to the community. I have a place here.
Mhm.
So, when officers go through shootings and all of a sudden they're under the scrutiny of their own department,
Mm.
what do you think that brings up for someone?
It's definitely
Oh,
triggering,
yes, it
right?
actually triggers even childhood things. So that's where, in my line of work with what I do, whenever I contract with departments and I speak with employers, administrators, city council members, so on and so forth, I'm telling them a bulk of our work is related to things personal to the individual, and it's probably existing in the home life, and it's manifesting or triggered by what happens with work. Most of them can do a lot of these traumatic exposures and not be traumatized. That's
Mhm.
wonderful. They have such high levels of resiliency, but if you get just the right one that poked at something unique to them, that's usually where we start to see problems exist.
And I think that you bring up a really good point is, when we think about law enforcement, we have these expectations of who they should be and how
Yes.
they should behave, right? But in any given moment, in any given situation that they're in, they themselves may not even be aware of what could happen, right?
Yes.
So, could they be triggered, right? Some people, I know from my personal experience that it wasn't until adulthood that one, I recognized that I was actually being triggered. Right. When I would behave or respond in these ways, I just, like I thought everybody else was doing something like
For
this way or
sure.
whatever. And then whenever I began to become aware, oh, wait, this is a trigger and this is connected to early childhood, right?
Mhm.
And then, to be confronted with that. But these officers are not always aware of
Nope.
this is going on and that they're dealing with these things, but yet the general public, the populace, they just have these expectations that, well, you're supposed to.
Correct, because we have historically trained law enforcement similar to our soldiers, which is I don't need you to feel, I need you to do.
Mm,
I focus on doing and action. And believe it or not, the skill set of emotional neutrality is an amazing tool for resiliency. So my running joke is I don't want to make a bunch of marshmallows. You still need to go out and do the job.
mm,
So if I call 911 for my mother, I hope you are on and you are focused on her, not what your emotional experience is. So I tell people again, emotional neutrality, being able to disconnect, that's a skill set that cops have developed. And we really want to foster that, but we want to help them learn how to harness it in a way that's helpful because when they get to be humans, because remember, soldiers, particularly if they're deployed, at some point, they never get to stop being a soldier. They're a soldier until they discharge. Whereas a cop, on, off, on, off. For an
mm.
8-hour shift, a 10-hour shift, a 12-hour shift, they're a cop. And then they're supposed to go off and be a human. That's when I want to like turn off that skill set of emotional neutrality and help them be able to confront those emotions in a healthy way and realize, yeah, you can be angry, you can be scared, you can be upset, you can be all these things. But that's where part of that stigma has come in. No one has really inserted a focus on psychological mindedness
Mhm.
as a tool of mental resiliency for cops up until more recent years.
Would you think that emotional neutrality is detrimental in their ability to kind of be able to be responsive to the needs of the individuals that they're encountering, like offenders and victims?
I think so. Yes. I think it can be if applied incorrectly.
Mm,
So I think emotional neutrality can be very helpful if you're in a shooting and I would like you to survive, not focused on how scared you are,
mm,
right? Or if there is a baby that was found in a pool and you're the first on scene and you get there and you take action and you're not consciously registering at that is a baby that might die. Like, I don't want you to connect with those thoughts yet.
Mm.
But I do believe emotional neutrality can be applied at their disservice, particularly if we talk about inherent biases that might exist, which we all have inherent biases, even the most open, transparent of us, like those of us that really pride ourselves on being inclusive and open-minded, like we still all have inherent biases that we have to
Right.
confront, have to challenge, and we hope when they can become our conscious awareness that we can.
Right. Yeah. So the idea of implicit bias, like
Yep.
it's huge with, and they're doing a lot of training within
Yes.
law enforcement on that, so they can be cognizant of that. So we've talked a little bit about community rejection. We've talked about rejection within their personal lives. We've talked about scrutiny. Let's talk about the challenges that they're facing with dealing with their day to day, just walking into, whether it be, a child who's been abused, or a woman who's been victimized, or a man who's been attacked, or whatever these situations are. um, you know what are their biggest challenges and struggles that they're having?
Oh, I don't know if I can point out the biggest ones as much as, like, how about this? Let me paint the picture of an example of a day for a cop, right?
Yeah.
So, what if I were to paint the picture of one that worked evenings? So, this is a person that maybe recently went through a divorce. They are struggling with sensations of loneliness. They're, working through their finances, so they have financial stressors. Um, because they're a midnight person, they might not be feeling that great, not exercising, not doing any self-care things. So every time they wake up and they look in the mirror and they don't like the way they look, that adds to it as well. And maybe they're assigned to a shift with a supervisor who tends to be highly critical and, watching them. So they have been doing midnight shift, which means they're down to about 3 to 4 hours of sleep per night. And it's not even really great sleep. So they wake up tired to all these stressors. Then they drive to work. And their first call of the night is a suicide.
Mm.
And then they have to go right from a suicide to a domestic where people are just fighting for no reason. And so they have to deal with that argument when really the expectation is, people, could you just deal with your own problems, right? I've got enough of my own.
Right.
So then after they deal with that call, they're sitting in their car and they're back to this sense of loneliness because it's kind of quiet. There's a lull in their shift. And then they're thinking about their finances and how much more can I work, or how much is the credit card debt going to add up, or I haven't talked to my kids in a while. I really miss them. Did I make a mistake? Did I do this? And then all of a sudden they got to go and there's a death. Maybe it's a kid. Maybe it's a kid that got hit by a car in the middle of the night in a not so great area. That could be a normal shift. They do that for 8 to 10 hours, depending what their assignment is. And then they got to get in an argument with their supervisor. Maybe they get involved in a shooting. Shootings aren't rare, but they don't happen every day. There was one night that St. Pete PD had 3 suicides in one area. It was constant. Let alone, what if something happens to one of your own people? Like all of a sudden, one of your own people is suicidal. And you're getting this phone call because, by the way, on your shift, you're talking to your squad mates, assuming that you get along with them and you feel comfortable, and they have their own issues that you're hearing. So I don't know if I can tell you the biggest problems as much as, like, anybody that's listening to this podcast, think about the problems that you have. They have them too, on top of all of the work-related exposures that they have to deal with.
Right. Yeah. And you lead to another important point that we need to talk about is law enforcement have some of the highest rates of divorce,
Mhm.
and the highest rates of suicide,
Correct.
right? And this speaks to the very, very difficult and sensitive and challenging nature of what they do, right?
Mhm.
And you mentioned previously, with the public, they love them, they hate them, they love them, they hate them, they go through these cycles, right? It's almost like the making of a trauma bond,
Yeah.
right? It's the, adoration and then the withdrawal, and it's no wonder, right? But we betray them every day. We walk away from their needs and what supports that they need. Um, and it leads me to, maybe if you could talk a little bit about some of the things that, some of the supports that are given to law enforcement, because I know that it's very insular, right?
Mhm.
They're doing for themselves because the greater public just isn't, right? It's a very polarizing relationship that we have with law enforcement.
Correct. Yeah.
Either they're great and they can do everything for us, or they're the worst, right? And we don't need you,
Mhm.
right?
Well, and realistically, what the running joke is, cops get called for the problems and firefighters get called to save the day and get the kittens out of the tree.
Yeah.
So, not totally and completely true, but realistically, the bulk of law enforcement interaction with the community is adversarial and
Mhm.
negative, not even by virtue of the officer themselves. It's just the nature of their job. They are
Right.
there for people's worst days.
Right.
But yes, I think our society as a whole doesn't do a great job of extending gratitude back
Mhm.
after moments of feeling scared. I think as a society we've become very egocentric. So cops aren't often getting the follow-up of like, thank you so much. That
But
rarely
we give them
happens.
discounts at food places.
Yeah, that's cool. But and once in a while, they'll be buying like Starbucks and someone behind them pays for it. But you do realize that also makes them uncomfortable too.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
they get so uncomfortable. And like, so, but when the general public does want to show gratitude and they do so in like whatever benevolent way they think, cops still don't know how to take it and be okay with it.
Well, I
Oh,
think they're not
yeah.
used to it, right?
They're
Because
so
they're
not
the
used to it.
helpers. They're the savers, they're the rescuers,
Yeah.
right? And then all of a sudden, people are trying to take that role and they're like, hold on just a second, this is my identity,
Yeah.
right? I'm supposed to rescue you. But I think that our general public, we just have a very adversarial view of law enforcement.
Yeah, I do. And I think to your point, what you asked about, like what supports exist, and hopefully answering your question, yes, very insular. And historically, the field has left it to cops just have an EAP or an insurance product.
Mm.
That's it. So it's whatever every city employee gets is what the cop city employee gets, which definitely never met the mark. You can ask anyone that's been in the field for way too long, and they would tell you, oh my God, EAP, nobody would ever touch it. Let me tell you all the war stories about how I made the therapist cry. They had no idea. So that was actually where, when I developed my company, the goal was to help create a solution for all the problems that existed where mental health care was inaccessible to law enforcement. And so my company, as a private practice, and I'm not the only one in the United States, there's other providers. Police psychology is growing as a field. So there are other equally qualified providers that are providing therapy on an outpatient basis. That being said, a cop has to get lucky enough to find one too, right?
Yeah.
Lucky enough that they take insurance, and usually good therapists do self-pay.
Right.
So it is what it is. The development of peer support teams and agencies has been a huge advancement in the field of support. And peer support teams are when peers within the department at different levels, different assignments are voted in as recognized as trustworthy, grounded, a person that people go to for advice and feel safe with. There's usually a very organized process by how you do this, but these peer supporters who are just other law enforcement officers or detectives or supervisors, they go through specialty training to learn active listening, therapeutic conversation skills, how to recognize mental health symptoms that need to be addressed, what resources exist out there, and they're identified amongst their peers as a resource to go to if you don't want to go to a psych or and you don't want your supervisor to find out. So
Right.
peer supporters are huge. Mutual support amongst their peers. I do think chaplaincy programs can be wonderful, but not everyone's religious either. So yeah.
So I have a question. So we're talking about accessibility and everything. Do most of your clients do they come to you willingly, or are they referred to you? And then are they an older or younger generation? Because I know younger more now, we're more focused on mental health, but older generation, I mean, you could ask my parents, my grandparents are no, you're fine. You do it yourself.
Yes.
So who comes to you willingly and all that?
Okay. Such a good question. My company is a little unique because I work with major municipalities, so cities, to contract with them. So my company serves as a ancillary support to EAP. So they still have their EAP, but we are like a concierge sort of service specifically for cops and firefighters, like City of St. Pete, for example, which means when they call us, it's carefully curated treatment plans. And I know I'm using a lot of salespeople words, but there's no other words to use it. I'm taking you as a cop, and you're not just a cop. You have XYZ factors, and this is your curated plan with our providers. It's really cool. The bulk of our people, though, come to us voluntarily. So we are advertised all throughout the agencies. We've been with City of St. Pete now, don't quote me, 7, 8 years. And then we have all these other cities on top of that. But over time, word of mouth is huge. And then to your question about the populace, who seeks us out? Believe it or not, both. And it's my old salty dogs that are my favorite to be converts to therapy. Because they're always I didn't know that this would be so great. And I'm yeah, buddy. And you know what they're looking for? They are they typically come in because they're looking for a solution for the problem, because that's the only way they think. Problem solvers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Until they realize, wow, do you know what's really good about therapy? I don't have to be on. It just is here, will you take my bag of crap for a little bit? I'm going to be a human, but then I take it back. And it's they get so much conscious decision making in that. It's safe, it's confidential. They get to say all the things that they think and never come out. And they get to say it, and someone's there going oh yeah, that's a thing. Or, oh, brother, of course you feel that way. And it's the second that they don't have to be on. Because remember, they're a cop, so they're on in their working hours. But then when they go home, they're typically the go-to person at home too. So then they're on there. So we get a mix of both.
Oh,
Young,
I
old,
love that.
all between. Yep.
That makes me feel so happy.
Doesn't it? I love an old salty
Yes.
dog coming in.
Because everyone, all the older people I meet just don't want to talk about it, and I love that they know that they can go and talk to people because they're humans, like we've been saying.
I do think most of my older people, to your observation though, most older people seek our services out. When I say older, they're not old. Let's say they are a senior generation of the law enforcement force. They're 10 plus years in. They do typically seek us out from a medical model perspective, meaning I believe there's a problem and I need a solution. Whereas I do think some of our younger people tend to seek us out because they're curious about self-development. I want to be better.
Right.
So I do think the reasons for starting therapy differ, but I think they eventually track to the same place, which is beautiful.
Oh, I love that.
I think you bring up a good point though about them being able to kind of set it down, right, when they come to therapy. And I think that largely the validation that they get in those moments is probably what keeps them coming back, because they experience a lot of rejection, right, out in the world. And also, we as a populace expect law enforcement to just deal with the worst of the worst and move on. and we're never attentive to their needs. I don't think that you hear often um, anybody in the populace really, or general public, saying things like, that must be hard.
Yeah.
It must be challenging. Or I can see how maybe that situation went wrong. Or I can understand how that officer might have made that choice. We had an officer come on last week, and he brought up the example of the law enforcement officer in South Carolina. It was years back, and he had a violent altercation with an individual, and the individual reaches for his taser and then gets away, and the officer, shoots him in the back. And I think a lot of times, and at the moment, the general public was very, very harsh and came down very, very hard. And in our conversations, we were talking about, just in those moments, like, you're afraid for your life. You have no idea what's going to happen. And I'm going to be honest, like, I understand how you could shoot somebody that's running away from you after you just had that. It's not like he shot a random person unprovoked, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that as a public, we forget about everything that they're going through and everything that they're forced to deal with or challenge with. And even this idea that, as you mentioned, they're going back to back to back, right? There's a spillover,
Oh, for sure.
and
For sure.
it even happens from day to day. And as they are in this career longer and longer and longer, it's only like we have to understand their purview,
Mm-hmm.
right? How they can get to where they are, and their mindset of, this is what I experience out in the world, or to have that negative worldview, right? They're having very little positive interaction in their life. And then if they go home to the personal, right?
Yeah.
And it's just everywhere. And it creates a very toxic environment for these individuals. And, like, we have to really get to a place where we as a populace, we can really begin to see them as humans, right?
Yes, absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. I mean, they're humans. They have a great responsibility. And quite frankly, a bulk of these people, I'm so glad they are in the position that they're in. I certainly did not sign up for this job. I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
But people don't want to sign up for my job either. And so
Yeah.
I'm glad that they are there. But yes, they are humans. Their wiggle room for making mistakes, like, that's one of the things we do work on in therapy, is like, you're human and you're allowed to make a mistake. But remember, your mistakes do come with things. So what are you doing to manage yourself responsibly,
Right.
ethically, healthy along the way? So, like, I'll just bring up one of the more obvious, like alcohol use, huge. Steroid use, huge.
Yeah.
Adderall, another big one. All these people are using all these substances back and forth. And it's like, buddy, if you get a DUI, or you get into a domestic, or you get into a fight because you were drinking, you do realize your consequences are much greater than if I did it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
we've got to, like, the problem is not that you're drinking in the first place, because that's an extension of a greater problem that we have to work on.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
more of, let's get to the root of the problem so that it doesn't cause you any additional consequences, because your consequences will be bigger than the normal everyday person.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
you're also being put in those positions too, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you're being put in the position of protect and serve, and you are sleep deprived, hungover, and then just using Adderall to treat yourself to keep moving, or caffeine,
Right.
you could make a very big mistake on duty that then would result in, like, public crucifixion, which is not fair either.
No.
But that's where,
Yeah.
like, again, I think when we do talk about mental health and law enforcement, that has been one of my biggest initiatives, at least in my small little local area of this, like, county region, is going to administration and really helping them understand, you do get that a lot of our behavioral issues are actually extensions of something much deeper.
Right.
So if we got abusive time off, someone that's underperforming, someone that is fighting with their supervisor, has an attitude problem, someone that does get into a domestic with their significant
These are
other.
all manifestations of a much bigger problem.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that it's important. The biggest takeaway, I think, is that we have to recognize that these individuals are humans.
Mhm.
They have a great responsibility. It's an unfair system.
Yes.
And as a populace, if we want policing to evolve into something different, right, we've got to begin to provide the supports on a societal level for these individuals that go out and do the things that we don't want to do, because at the end of the day, they're humans.
Yes.
Mhm.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank y'all for joining me. This has been The Beat, and we hope to see you next time.